Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Soul-Centered Astrology Summit. I'm your host, Suzanne Gerber, and for today's interview, you probably want to keep your astrology notebook handy. Samuel F. Reynolds is going to talk about soul and spirit from what might be a very different perspective for some of us, from a very classical perspective. And these ways of describing things are sure to illuminate the concepts in some very mind-expanding ways. Sam used to be proud of being an astrology skeptic until he had his chart read for the first time. That astrologer's insight into his life were so uncanny that he was inspired to study astrology for himself. That was 30 years ago, and Sam's been immersed in astrology ever since. Today, he has a very active consulting practice and teaches full-time. He's a co-founder of the International Society of Black Astrologers and serves as president of the board of directors for the International Academy of Astrology. And it is my tremendous pleasure to welcome Sam back to the summit. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Suzanne, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, and I'm so glad you could make it.
Thank
Uh,
you.
so I love what you're going to talk about, and it really is going to be very educational, I think. A lot of people, especially people who have evolutionary astrological leanings, and even if they don't, people tend to think about the lunar nodes as the indication of soul or spirit, or maybe they think about Pluto as soul. You're going in a very different direction from coming from a classical perspective. And for me, rather than trying to guess and anticipate, I'm just going to let you take it from the top and give us really a good explanation of what this is and what people are going to learn and how. And you know what I love is helping people find this in their charts and use it to enhance their own lives. And I know you're really great at doing that. So
Oh, thank
without
you.
without further ado,
All right. Well, I'm going to share my screen. So, yeah, I'm going to go into talking about other symbols for the soul. And you mentioned a few others. I am going to go into both classical and a modern symbol of the soul, but from a different context. So, one quote I'm going to use is from Porphyry, letter to Anibo. um, just to open it up, and he says, he is surely happy Udaimon, who, learning the celestial configuration of his birth, and hence recognizing his personal diamond, that is more the Greek spelling, is enabled to neutralize by sacrifices the power of fate. And so this introduces us to a different view of the soul's journey. And we're going to talk about this in relation to the daemon, which is the Latin form or spelling of it, in three different ways. And there are multiple other ways to do it. Like there are 6 to 10 different techniques that one could get into to discover one's daemon, but we're just going to focus on three: the lot of spirit, the 11th and 12th houses, classically, and Uranus in personal and transpersonal terms. So Uranus is more the modern designation. So we're going to answer, what is the daemon and the daemonic? What do I mean by that? Because for those of you who may come from a fundamentalist background and be like, oh, I knew astrology was demonic, or maybe my father or my mother was right. No, you note the spelling. It's not the same as demon. And in fact, we could say demon is a corruption from those who were fearful in understanding the daemon. So I think that's one other part. I'm going to talk about what the lot of spirit is and how to calculate it, to gain more clues about your daemon from your 11th and 12th houses, and then talking about the personal and generational mission that one can learn about through Uranus. Now, one thing you might say, like, well, why are we looking at these different techniques? And I think that's a sensible question. And then I'll explain a little bit about this myth, giving people a heads up on being able to read it if they can multitask, listen, and read at the same time, because I'm not going to read everything that's there. But one of the reasons why I'm looking at various techniques, and I'm going to repeat this again, is that I don't believe that there is any one technique one can use to to understand the dimensions of the soul or the daemon. And I think that's very important to learn these different techniques as a way of getting reflection, reflecting the sky back to you and getting insight. But I also would say ritualistically to kind of hook into your understanding of these planets and your chart in order to give you a different perspective. So this is why we're mentioning these different techniques, not because like, oh, you can't decide on which one to use. Is that right, Sam Reynolds? No, it's that you can use them all, um, just to kind of get some perspective. And then you have to go with what resonates, what speaks to you on the soul level. Okay. So one critical myth or story that helps us understand the ancient Greek perspective on what is the daemon is this myth of which is from Plato's Republic. And was a Greek soldier, as you can read here, who basically goes into the underworld and actually isn't dead, but thinks he is. And what he discovers, and is a whole, this is the very abbreviated Cliff Notes version, but he basically sees the workings of how one comes into the world, how one incarnates or reincarnates back into the world. And he discovers that we choose a particular life, and because those lots, and that's a word we're going to come back to, lots are thrown in front of you, and lots we could say are shiny trinkets, or just like we throw straw or whatever, or dice. Imagine like those are like the idea of the lot. It's thrown in front of you, and you either choose wisely or foolishly the life that you're going to take. And when you have chosen that life, you get a genius or a daemon that incarnates with you. Now, one of the reasons why I just used that word genius is that is also the Latin Romanized version of the daemon. And genius wasn't something that was related to your IQ or intelligence. The classic notion of genius was that spirit that incarnated with you, and someone who was in touch with that spirit, who really, grasped the hem of their spirit. That was a moment of genius. It wasn't so much that we are geniuses, but you were in touch with your genius, with your spirit, your guide. So Air, goes through this journey, and then he wakes up on the pyre realizing that he is not dead, and relates this story. Now, whether this is actually true or how it is, we don't know, but we trust that this is what we have from Plato. And this image, which I hope is evocative, relates to something else that Plato talks about as the journey back into, or journey into soul or into embodiment. And he talks about how we go through, each realm of the planetary spheres, the seven heavens, related to the seven traditional planets. And as we move through each sphere, we take on some of the qualities, either bad, middling, as he said, or higher qualities of each sphere, to come with our own virtues and vices. And as we descend into matter, the work of the soul, from the classic point of view, was to ascend back using ritualistic practices, talismans, other ways of connecting with these spheres in order to take the best and build our sense of character and to resume back toward the one. And this becomes important because something I'm going to talk about a little later is that the Greeks, and then the Romans, saw more our evolution related to how we build our character, rather than so much from the Indian subcontinent view of our karma. You can make a correlation if you're more familiar with karma, that's fine. But the classic idea is that you dealt with your character related to your vices and your virtues. So this is a quote from Iamblichus, who we would define as a Neoplatonist, who existed some almost 1,000 years after, 600 years after Plato. And we would say that the work of being in touch with your daemon was really to kind of get away from our animalistic nature and get more in touch with the gods, with our divinity. And so this is one particular quote from Iamblichus's De Mysteriis. And so when I talk about character, and this is a quote, or this is some line of thinking from, I don't know if you say his name, Jaime or Jamie Paul Lamb, who would say that the chart is a schematic of character, going back to this idea that the work of the soul and the daemon is not just guiding us through our quote unquote destiny, but really strengthening our character, how we can improve as people, how we can, become more generous of spirit, um, fearless, more, ways in which we also tap into greater dimensions of love. I thought I'd give a little bit of a etymology and also some other ways in which to understand the daemon by first focusing on the Greek notion of the daemon, which is spelled and also pronounced as diamond. One way to think about this, especially since, we are initially talking, we were just recently have gone through a Mercury retrograde, is that Mercury is kind of the template of the idea of a daemon
Hmm.
as the intermediary being between the gods and humanity. And there's some who have the view that Mercury was Jupiter's daemon, because Mercury was the only deity that can go between the three worlds, Olympus, Earth, and Hades.
Hmm.
There was no other god that really could do that. And so that gives us a clue on what our daemon may be as kind of a conduit to be able to deal with, the multiple dimensions in which we experience life. And that also goes to the Proto-Indo-European origin of the word, which is to see the daemon as a provider, as a divider, and not dividing us from ourselves, but helping us realize the world's division is some way in which we can, come to better perceive, take advantage of, receive our fortunes or destinies. One other way of thinking about this is it's our calling and at the same time our inner voice. For those of you who do have more of a fundamentalist background, as I do, I was a Christian minister when I was younger, is the parallel might be of the prophet Samuel. And if anyone's familiar with that story, which you can find in the Bible, I think in the book of Judges, if you want to look for it specifically, is where Samuel was called and called toward prophethood and toward the ministry. And so was that a manifestation of God or his daemon? However you want to split it in terms of how to give you an illustration. So this is going back to the point I made, the Neoplatonists like Plotinus and Porphyry and Iamblichus, well, less Iamblichus, they believe that you could use various techniques to figure out your daemon. And it wouldn't be so much that you would be able to name your daemon by name. That comes later in the tradition. But it was more so figuring out which planet of the seven traditional planet gives you a clue about the nature of your daemon, and that's going from Sun all the way to Saturn. It wouldn't include the outer planets or the nodes, for example. Now, this is where I differ from Plotinus and some of the others, and I go along with Iamblichus, who saw more the work of the daemon in more personal terms as an act of contemplation, as a way in which you, through ritual, through honoring your daemon or connecting with your daemon, sort of like um the way people say this. So one of the things I would say when I was a fundamentalist, uh, this is a familiar phrase, and maybe you've heard it, Suzanne, too. Like, do you know Jesus is your personal Savior and Lord? And, you know, I just would say it because I heard others say it. I was also younger. I was pretty much a child. I was in the ministry from 12 to 19 years old. And but when you think about it, what does it mean like to be your personal Lord and Savior, right?
Mm,
So your daemon, I'm not saying is necessarily your personal Lord and Savior, but it is a personal connection. And so Iamblichus was talking about how you have a direct personal relationship with it, with your daemon. And you're like, well, draw that home more. Well, let's put it a different way. Rather than saying, like, well, my grandma believes in Jesus and my family believes in Jesus, like, well, what is your relationship to Jesus? And so, what is your relationship to your daemon? And your daemon, as maybe he's speaking to you through the sun, through the moon, through Venus. So, before we got on, uh, Suzanne was talking a little bit about her Venusian sensibilities. It's
mhm,
very possible that her daemon is reflected through Venus. And so by honoring Venus on Venus days, Venus hours, particular things, she comes in more congruence and alignment with her daemon, and then thus, some measure of her character, and then by extension, destiny. This is what Iamblichus was saying. But he wasn't saying that we can just understand this singularly or solely through a natal chart. So let's tackle one of the ways in which we can get in touch with the daemon by looking at the lot of spirit. Now, I want to say a little bit about that phrase because you might see, as I'm mentioning at the top there, the part of the daemon. Um, Also, it's called Arabic parts. These are the same, meaning Arabic parts is the general name given for the lots, different calculations that one can use to figure out aspects about your life. There's a lot of the father, there's a lot of the mother, there's a lot of the brother, there's a lot of your wife, there's a lot of your husband, all these different things. And lot was used similarly as a synonym with part. So they are the same. But the actual word lot, as it's used in Greek, kleros, was the idea of like how we use and think about dice as an example. So what is a lot of spirit? There's a couple different definitions that I'll definitely share, but one is from Robert Hand, who I haven't quoted again, so forgive me for saying again because I haven't quoted initially, but the lot of spirit has to do with the nature of the will, what you intend as opposed to what merely happens to you. Also deals with the career. So this is what you more initiate. One of the other names for the lot of the spirit is a lot of the sun. So there's a lot of fortune, which is the lot of the moon, and a lot of spirits, a lot of the sun. So this is where you direct some measure of your will, your desire, what you revere, cherish, and hold in high spiritual regard. So this is another way in which you can understand what this means. It's also the way by which you get in touch with, when I say your daemon, the essence of your will. And you're like, what do you mean by that? Well, let's go back to the myth of Ur. Remember, lots would be cast in front of you, according to this myth. By virtue of an act of will, you supposedly choose. And then the corresponding daemon incarnates with you based on your choice. So the lot of spirit is some way in which you get in touch with your act of will, the essence of your will, what what drives you. So contemplating the daemon at the level of lots. So here I go more into some different definitions of the lot of spirit. Again, I won't read everything as mentioned here. There's a quote from Olympiodorus, who's also a classical Hellenistic astrologer. And he says that the lot of the good daemon, same as the lot of spirit, since we can get to know the character of the soul, intentional mind, and purpose from this lot. He says more, but I think that's the essence of what I would want you to draw. Then going along with the idea of career, and what's interesting, like, well, career, like I didn't choose my career, I work at Wendy's. Um, you know, That's not what I want to do. My career is as an artist. Career is not the same as job because we can have a job and it be reflective of our vocation. And I love that word vocation because it relates in Latin to vocare, which is a calling. And you might remember that's what I was talking about related to the daemon earlier, where you have the call. And I was talking about Samuel being called. So your career here is the act of your will. There are people who work as security guards who are writers, right? Um, and that is their vocare, that's their vocation. So this is where you have the sense of the career that I'm talking about. Robert Zoller, who also was a classical, um, I shouldn't say was a classical astrologer because he was a modern astrologer interested in classical uh, things. He says this is also the lot of hidden things and everything which is absent. Again, this relates to where you either have to use will or intentionality to find things or the things that are hidden, that are beyond, just the key aspects of sight, which is different from the lot of fortune. The lot of fortune is more about what you see. Here's some more about it. Robert Zoller also talks about this, um, indicating what the person might venerate or sees as God. And we could say the part of fortune or the lot of fortune would be a descending influence of divinity in matter, while the part of spirit reaches up or beyond. That's important because remember, I said that we go through incarnation toward or through a descent in order in life to reach up and go toward an ascent. This is a quote that I do like from Dorian Geisler Greenbaum, again, a contemporary astrologer who has a book called The Daemon in Hellenistic Astrology, Origins and Influences. Let me say this. Before you look up this book and you're like, I'm going to get that book, I just want you to know it's very expensive. It's like $300 or $400. It's an academic book. So unless you're really into academic texts, um, you may not be able to, you may not get it, but so I'm drawing from it. And she says, through the daemon, we can process the light of both the sun and the sun representing nous or knowledge, its place in the soul, and the moon representing the body, which holds the soul in our human incarnation. This is critical because many people who have studied astrology more through the modern lens know the moon only as representing our emotions. But classically, the moon was also representing our body. So this daemon partakes of both, and in astrology, we can see this combination in the lots of fortune. Again, a lot of the moon, which deals with our physical dimensions, and daemon, which is more about the spiritual or our will or intention, and the points in which form them, the sun, moon, and hour marker, which we call the ascendant, our point of personal incarnation, the point of our appearance on earth. How do you calculate this? So let me show you this. Um, and I'm not going to go too deep into this because I think I have an easier way for you. So here in this box are the different formula, which is taking the degree of your ascendant, the degree and minute of your moon, and moving it from the sun. Um, that's for the lot of fortune. The lot of spirit does the exact same thing, but it reverses it. So if you were born during the day, meaning the sun was above the horizon when you were born, meaning it's through the 12th, through the 7th house, then you would use this formula. If you were born with the sun beneath the horizon, then you would use the night formula. Now, how do you know? This is where you need to look at your chart because you cannot just go by your time. So, for instance, we're doing this in the spring, 7 p.m. in most places is going to be still the day. The sun is above the horizon. But if we were doing this in the winter, then 7 p.m. would be in most places, at least in the United States, if not most of the the northern hemisphere, it would be night. So this is where you have to kind of take into account the location. This is also true, like if you're in more northern climes, like even London or Paris, actually night may not come until 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. So you have to kind of go by this. You're like, well, what's the easier way to do this? Because I don't want to figure out these degrees and all that. Well, I'll just skip ahead and say this. Let the computer do it.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk you through the steps, and there's a particular site you can go to where you can do this, and it's really easy. I do want to show you one quick thing. So one of the reasons why it's actually pretty easy to do this, especially with a day chart. I'm looking at Prince William's chart, and I want you to note he's born at 9:03 p.m. in London, England, in the UK, on June 21st, 1982. You will note, per what I said, that his sun is above the horizon. So at 9 o'clock at night, he's still a day chart. Now, sun, moon. So we are trying to figure out the lot of spirit, which is the lot of the sun. So if we were to put the moon, and he's a new moon. So if we were to put the moon at the ascendant, that means that his lot of spirit has to be pretty close to the moon, within maybe 4 degrees. So the ascendant is the marker we use to kind of designate where the lot falls. And here it is. So what would happen if we were put the ascendant, or put the sun at the ascendant, right? Going this way, the distance. The lot of spirit actually ends up about 4 degrees away from the ascendant. So that's how you kind of have to figure it out. You can, this is one way if you want to eyeball it, depending on your chart. The easiest way, let the computer do it. How do you do it? Well, I recommend going to a site called astral-seek.com, and you can actually set up an account and do it. It's all free, by the way. This is all free. Let me say that word again, free. So you don't have to pay anything. So you go to astral-seek.com, and then you go to traditional astrology calculator, which is when you go to free horoscopes and you get a whole menu of different options. You can go to traditional astrology calculator. It will take you to this page. If you haven't signed up, then you could put in your birth information or anyone else's birth information in there, and it will find it for you. And then you're going to choose Lot of Fortune, Spirit, Eros. You click on that link, and then it will take you to the third step and show you, based on these formula, your lot of Spirit and Eros. Now, it's not showing this here, but if you scroll down, like as I went to this page earlier, you'll see it. And you can find out your lot of spirit the easy way. You don't have to sit and calculate as I've had to do. But like I said, there's one way in which you can eye it. So if you put the sun at the ascendant, then the moon is almost going to be like a marker for you to find out the lot of spirit. Conversely, if you put the moon on the ascendant, this is going to be more so how it reveals the lot of fortune. But again, easy way is to do it this way. Okay, now let me pause here because I'm about to shift gears and talk about the daemon as reflected through the 12th and 11th house. And I'm going to also explain why I went in that order. Why didn't you just go in numerical order, 11 and 12? Well, 12 and then 11. But before I do that, I'm going to ask Suzanne if she has any questions or things that we could anticipate from the audience.
Well, I think I don't know if you're leaving the lot of spirit, Sam, and shifting gears totally and going into 11 and 12. But I could imagine people say, oh, what do I do with this? Is there like a lot of fortune people, a lot of people work with that, and they might see it as, I know it used to be how we made our money, how we got riches, but in a more modern, psychologically oriented approach, we think of it as what is enriching to us. So we look at it as something that can reinforce other themes that we see. And if people don't really quite know, they haven't quite gotten so connected with this approach with the daemon, what would be a shorthand way for them to make sense of it? Because you've dropped it into Prince William's, for example. And that may or may not, most people are probably familiar with him. What might one say? What else might one connect it to in the chart to have it be more revealing?
Excellent question. So his lot of spirit, let me make sure I'm using the right here. I'll use the laser pointer. His lot of spirit is at 22 degrees Sagittarius. Now, the difference between some aspect of modern astrology and traditional astrology is what signs mean. And I don't mean like, oh, Sagittarius means something completely different. It's more so Sagittarius means something a little less. It means more so, not so much like, oh, I start expounding on, his lot of fortune or a lot of spirit is connected to Neptune, and it's in Sag, and so he may be adventurous and all. The idea for the classical mindset of a sign is tell me where the ruler is. So it wasn't so much to expound on the sign. That's more modern. We've kind of made more of signs than our ancient forebears. So the real clue comes from Jupiter, which is the ruler of Sagittarius. And we use classical rulers. So for Pisces, it still would be Jupiter. For Aquarius, it would be Saturn. And for Scorpio, it would be Mars in this lineup. So we get a clue. Jupiter is conjoined to the midheaven. So, and it's in Scorpio and it's retrograde. So what does this mean? It means in understanding his lot of spirit, his intentionality. It is that he will be at some point the ruler, Jupiter, conjoined to the midheaven, like his grandmother to some degree, who also had a strong Saturn, I think, close to the midheaven. And just to be clear, that's Queen Elizabeth II. Um, Jupiter is conjoined to the midheaven, so he's to become king, but it's in the 12th house. So some measure of his intentionality is going to be being in the wings
Hmm.
and living in the wings related to it. But living into the wings, and what he reveres, remember, this is what the lot of spirit reflects. It's more so reflective of, Jupiter being generous, um, dealing with the aspects of generosity, um, basically trying to encourage more sense of understanding. And at the same time, you're like, well, it's in Scorpio. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's in the sign of Mars, and it's actually with a connection to Saturn. So it may be, even though William is in line to the throne, he may have his own challenges related to it. Now, we've seen this more through his brother, Harry, in Resistance. But I think, he actually may feel his own kind of, the word that comes to mind is awareness. You're like, so what does that have to
Hmm.
do with spirit? What does that have to do with his soul's journey? Well, that's kind of the work of his character, which is like, okay, you're close to the throne, to power, and it's in the 12th house using this whole sign house system. There may be some way in which you have a different vision of what royalty will look like, what the king and how the king functions, and how royalty functions. Some of this may be conditioned by um, what happened to his mom. Now, this has become much more ostensible and apparent with Harry. Harry even has a book out about it. William hasn't been in a position to be able to talk about it as much. not yet, because, he still has to ascend and he has the responsibility that Harry was never going to have. So, the other way in which we can think about it, this might give us a clue in understanding more about how he gets in touch with um, his spiritual understanding and mission, which is through Jupiter. So it's more so, like I mentioned, generosity, I mentioned wisdom. Jupiter also is ways by which we understand the broadness of life, whether that's in terms of travel and being open-minded. And so these are the things that Harry may bring more into the fore. His father is starting to do some of that, but I'm not going to get into like world politics. I don't know how far he's going to get with it. That's all I'll say. But um, William may do more work related to it, especially since Jupiter has what we call a trine to his moon and to his sun. Um, he may seem very serious, but I think there's a little more of a trickster, um, or even a mysterious quality that he may bring to, we already see this a little bit with, all the suspicions that people have about him, especially related to his wife. Um, he's going to bring a little more intrigue and curiosity related to uh his stepping into power. And also with Jupiter being conjoined to Scorpio, a sign of Mars, and then Saturn, it's going to be dealing with his relationship to power. That's part of what his spirit really is also, I'm going to put it in a weird way, wrestling with. So I hope
No,
that elucidates.
that does. That makes a lot of sense. And I will resist the temptation to talk about the Pluto, the transiting Pluto square, and what people might want to, where they might
Yeah,
want
but I'm glad you mentioned
to.
it. We can keep an eye on that. So just so everyone's clear, what Suzanne is mentioning is that as Pluto is going into his third house, it is going to square his Jupiter and his midheaven. So it's going to bring more pressure related to his spiritual growth, um, related to what I just said in terms of him, stepping into his royal responsibilities. So the classical idea of the daemon also was embedded into the houses. Let me talk a little bit about this. So in astrology's history, long history, even going back beyond Greek understanding, but also going into Babylonian, its origins, and then Egyptian, because the idea of houses kind of springs forth from an Egyptian understanding of the movement of the sun going from the east into the west, which is why we have all the mausoleums, which we call the pyramids, on the western side of the Nile, and moving from the rise of consciousness into the setting of consciousness and going into the underworld. So this relates to two particular ideas that have been embedded into astrology for a long time, which is the dynamic between spirit or the diamond and fortune or fate. And fate is more related to your material circumstances, your physical circumstances into which you were born. Spirit is more like, again, what's the mystery, the hidden, the things that we can't see, in terms of someone's intentions. Someone could be smiling at you and like, I want to eat you for lunch. Okay, I know that was really macabre, but Scorpio problems, right? But it's like, it's some way in which you can't know what someone is thinking. And that we just explored through the lots. But before that, or around the same time, we have this articulation related to what we call the 12th and 11th houses. You will notice that the 12th house is given this name, the bad spirit, and then the 11th house is the good spirit. Opposite to it You might see that the bad spirit was opposite to the bad fortune, which has Mars, and then Saturn, Mars, the malefics, as we call them. And then the benefics were given the good spirit and good fortune, which has Venus and Jupiter as the benefics. Now, you might look at this and like, well, my sun is in the 12th house. My moon is in the 12th house. Is it with a bad spirit? Am I a bad person? What does this all mean? Well, let's go more into it. I'm going to give you the classic idea of the idea of the bad spirit, and then I'm going to give a more modern take and a more modern understanding of it that I think may help. The 12th house, as you can see here, was deemed the place of things that we would rather avoid: suffering, enmities, like hidden enemies, sickness, dangers. And then on the opposite end, slaves, injuries, sickness, and enmities, more the same. I have a different take on what this might mean, and it's informed by a few interesting things. You might notice I said that the sun rises from east, and the actual diurnal motion of the sun goes this way. It goes from east to west, or what we would say left to right. This is also the same motion as clockwise. In fact, this is where clockwise comes from in terms of this motion going this way. The clock moves this way. So when the sun rises in the east, and I encourage anyone who hasn't done this in a while, go out and see a sunrise, or just go out before sunrise. One, because depending on the day, depending on where you are, it can be very beautiful to see. But you'll notice something very interesting. We're looking at the sky, the night sky, and ideally, if it's a clear night, we'll see stars. Perhaps like now, we'll see a moon, a glimpse of the moon, as it's going toward fullness to say. And you see it rising, the moon, or you see the sun rising. What is happening though? As it rises, the night sky disappears. We don't see the stars. We won't see the moon. The sun obliterates everything. So the bad spirit could be reflective of the things that we can't see, where we don't have the same sense of power and awareness. We have to kind of cultivate a different awareness. So rather than thinking that the bad spirit is about, like, your sun's there, or your moon is there, or your Mercury's there, and you're like, oh, it's more so you are plunged into the depths of seeking more that may be invisible to the naked eye. And by virtue of that, that requires us to be much more patient, attentive, and the word I'm going to use related to Saturn here is contemplative.
Mm.
And by virtue of having to cultivate this awareness, it prepares us. One of the analogies I give for understanding the bad spirit is like understanding a bad trip. Like if you have done ayahuasca or some mind-altering substance. If your mind is not prepared for it, if you haven't done the inner work, this is often how one has a bad trip or a bad experience. So what's the solution? Well, in understanding the 12th house and then the sign or the planets that are on the cusp of the 12th house or in the 12th house, it's where you start to contemplate more so what this directs you to be and do. So for instance, it also one of the nicknames I have for the 12th house is the padded room. Now, I know that's evocative, and I'm using it on purpose. And when I say the padded room, you're like, oh, straitjacket and being, surrounded by, in a padded room and all that. That's one particular image, which also relates to the classical and now modern idea of the 12th house. But so is a studio, a padded room. So this can be the space you create
Mm.
of any kind where you become dedicated to your own um mm, to insulate yourself toward a dedicated purpose where you are participating in something larger than yourself. So when the sun rises in the 12th house, it comes more among the stars, but because it's the closest star to us, it seems to obliterate all the other sight of the other stars to us, but not to the sun. So this is where we have to become more aware of the things that are beyond our control, where we can cultivate awe in our life. And the planets that you find in that house, or whatever planet rules the cusp. So, for instance, I'm a Pisces rising. So, Aquarius is on the cusp of that house. So, Saturn's the lord of that house for me. So, by virtue of how I get in touch with Saturn, I can deal with those things that are seemingly beyond my control, or how I find my way to participate in something larger than myself. Now, you're like, okay, so we did that with the bad spirit, the bad trip, the the padded room. What about the good spirit? Is that like Galinda and Elphaba, the bad witch? Well, not exactly, but the good spirit is more so now the sun is kind of hanging more in the sky. It's between 10 and 12, ideally 10 and 12 a.m., depending, where you are in the world. And by hanging there, that's more so now you're more comfortable with it. So this is the stage we could say the good spirit is where now you've come to its self-acceptance. It's accepting kind of what you encountered as difficult initially as you rise into your 12th house. This is where you might move from isolation of the 12th house and insulation. There is a difference. Isolation is where you just see yourself alone. But you could also see the 12th house as where you participate in the all one, right?
Mm.
Rather than alone. And acceptance moving into the 11th house is now where you can share that with others and you can participate in order that now you can see that you have established. So this is why it also includes friends, idea of hopes, gifts, and I can go more into why those significations are there. I mean, basically, the 10th house was seen as the place of the ruler or the royal. And so one of the reasons why it's your hopes or your gifts, because it's the second house from the 10th. So anything that you wanted belonged to the royal. So if you wanted to like be like Christopher Columbus and sail to the new world, but I don't have something I need for that. What do you need for that? Ships. So that was something that Queen Isabella and Queen Ferdinand was able to give to Christopher Columbus, right? As an example. So same thing in terms of becoming a duke of of Westchester or any kind of Edinburgh, any particular kind of land that was bestowed upon you from the 10th house. So reason why it also has a significations related to hopes and gifts and wishes is because it was the second from the 10th. So this is what you had to aspire for to get um, from the 10th. Could go more into that, but the key essence is understanding that the distinction between the bad spirit and the good spirit is we could say the good spirit is where you move toward the idea of acceptance. And so you might look at the cusp of that house and then what planet's there on accepting the gifts, the things that you can see in order to kind of move forward and participate in this larger order that is more physical, more tangible that you can see. Whereas the bad spirit is kind of has that designation because it relates to the things that we can't see, where we experience, and that's true for many of the quote unquote bad houses. There are three bad houses that are given historically in astrology: the 12th, the 8th, and the 6th. And that is for a simple reason. It's not because like, and if you have planets there, that doesn't mean you're bad, doesn't mean they're bad. It means that these are planets in houses that can't see adequately or directly the ascendant. And so the 12th house can't really see the ascendant. The eighth house has what we call a quincunx or 150 degrees. The sixth house has the same kind of relationship to it. So there's more work involved. There's more sacrifice involved. Just like we have to sacrifice taxes. The eighth house is where we pay tribute to things, as an example. So taxes, death. You're like, well, why death? Because the cost of being alive is that you may also have to die. Um, so these are all the things that, the eighth house, sixth house, these are things that appear beyond our control. And where we have to kind of also do the work of sacrifice and surrender. So I've explained some of these things here, the 11th house of the good daemon. So this is some aspiration. And I say the secret wish that seems beyond your control, but in actuality, by virtue of acceptance and having moved to the 12th house, it's more things that can come in your control if you're willing to put yourself out there, if you're willing to kind of share. And so the planets that are in your 11th house, the planets that are, or the planet that rules your 11th house will give you a clue of how you can start to negotiate and figure out this spiritual work. Um, Here's a little more about the 12th house. Um, and this gives us a clue, and I have a quote here from Alice Walker. What the mind doesn't understand, it worships or fears.
Hmm.
And so the work of the 12th house is really starting to deal with what does seem mysterious to you. What do you resist? Um, and then what you worship, why do you worship it? And what does it speak to? I could go more into this, and I will as an illustration, because I'm going to start talking about, the daemonic journey now as we go to Uranus. And I didn't provide a lot of examples, so I'm going to provide myself as an example. As I mentioned, I'm a Pisces rising. Aquarius is on the cusp of my 12th house. This is true whether you use a whole sign house system or you use a quadrant system like Placidus. And that means Saturn is the lord of my 12th house. I'm going to say something that may surprise some people, maybe not. Well, after I left the ministry, I had to deal with rock bottom disappointment and disillusionment related to my journey with faith. And so I went into a spat of a time for about 10 years of atheism. And when I say I went into atheism, this has several different implications. One of them is that I lost my faith and belief in truth with the capital T. The idea that there is something that's inherently just truth and truth itself. I used to say something pretty uh not nice about truth. Um, so I was like, truth doesn't really exist. What's been interesting is that in my journey in relationship to it, even up until like 3 years ago, and this is just kind of tagging in other forms of astrology. So I moved from the East Coast, where generally the Aquarius had always been in my 12th house. And I moved out here to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I become an Aquarius rising. So the 12th house becomes activated. And what's been interesting in the last 2, 3 years has been this rediscovery and belief in truth with a capital T.
Huh.
And so, and that also has come through a very Saturnian way, through study, through contemplation, but also through science, believe it or not. It wasn't astrology or metaphysics that brought it back the same way. That was more Saturn. So let's say, let's go with another example. You're a Libra rising, right? Um, then that means Virgo is on the cusp of your 12th house. So Mercury is going to give you more clues related to the quote unquote evil daemon, which might be, again, ways in which you don't understand. So it depends on where your Mercury is. Let's say your Mercury ends up in the 6th house. So it may be related to illness or routines or ways in which, if you're looking from a modern lens, how you give service, or how you work really hard. But the question becomes, as an illustration, do you work really smart or do you just work really hard?
Mhm.
Those are not the same. So you can start to think about, because one of the names for the 12th house was the house of self-undoing. And these are the ways in which you sabotage yourself because you don't know yourself. You can't see yourself. Remember, the self represents the ascendant, so you can't see it. So there are ways in which you have blind spots in understanding your sense. This is why I call it the region of the unfamiliar. But it's the unfamiliar and mysterious. If you cultivate this sense of awe or respect rather than just fear, you can come to see it differently. So these are two different ways using just houses by which we can understand the the position of the daemon. A lot of spirit, then the two houses. So there are different ways in which you can construct understanding yourself. Um, you can get a glimpse of your daemon rather than thinking that it's just one particular thing, and you start to get a composite picture. The more I've done this work related to the daemon over the last, I would say I started this in earnest in 2018 because I presented on this at UAC. And so it's been 6 years. And I've gotten a composite picture of my daemon. Maybe you could say an image in my mind, but you could also say a better understanding of myself and what's guiding me and what is holding. You could say the daemon is holding this truest image of yourself until you're willing to grasp it on your own. It holds the image that you came in with, that you have to kind of be willing to pursue and grasp yourself. But it comes with contemplation, it comes with thought, it comes with observing your astrology over time, contemplating your natal chart. Um, yeah, sure, getting readings, all these different ways in which you can embrace it. Well, I'm going to change things a little bit now and talk about the personal and transpersonal levels of your genius related to this planet that we understand and know as Uranus. Now, Uranus is fascinating to me for a lot of different reasons. Now, astrologically, it symbolizes surprises, disruptions, eruptions. We could say that it represents the cutting edge of culture and singularly our individuality, meaning that divine spark of who we are, the
Mm.
unique aspects of our genius. Richard Tarnas, who's written a very profound book called Cosmos and Psyche, believes that Uranus may have been misnamed and might benefit from being thought of as Prometheus, the Titan who stole fire from the gods in order to give humanity when Zeus denied fire to humanity in order to freeze him out and kill him. So we could say that Uranus is like the fire bringer, the activator, the awakener
Mhm.
in the aspect of our consciousness. And what is an awakening? Maybe the truest image of ourself, which might parallel or sound exactly what I just said about what the daemon does, which I think works. The other thing that's fascinating about Uranus, the planet itself, astronomically, astronomically, it's the only planet in our solar system that rotates on an east-west axis rather than the north-south. like all the other planets in our solar system. So it's weird, for real, right? Um, and weird is an interesting word because weird comes from related to the three fates, the weird sisters. And weird meant initially what becomes most individual, unique to you, related to your fate, or what becomes, like we could say again, that spark of your sense of self. So Uranus kind of taps into that. But Uranus is also what we call, beyond just being an outer planet, a generational planet. So this gets me to think about this quote from Frantz Fanon, who was a revolutionary Algerian writer and psychologist, where he says, each generation out of relative obscurity must discover its mission, fulfill or betray it. So I also have come to think about Uranus as a way to tap into our generation's mission. And I'm going to look at 7 generations from Uranus to Capricorn. And I would define the generation as related to what we call in astrology the quincunx, or being activated by the quincunx, when Uranus reaches 150 degrees away from the its original position. And that correlates because Uranus takes about 7 years to go through a sign. So if we do that, 7 times 5 is 35. And that is what we usually say is about nearly the span of a generation, um, as the reproductive cycles of parents to children. So that's about 35 years. Some people may say 30, some will say it's 35. It's within that ballpark. So this is another way in which you can start to contemplate your individuality, because I'm going to talk about it on a personal level too. But on the generational level, it's understanding, rather than saying like, I'm Gen X, I'm Gen Z, all these other ways in which we might understand it, we can understand it through this outer planet. Uranus in Cancer, 1948 to August 1955. This is what they were dealing with, as we come through their conception. Coming off the horrors of World War II to create more of the idyllic 50s, beginning of the Cold War and the need to keep safe. Into the war brought huge shifts in how the world had been organized colonially. Suddenly the world had both gotten smaller and more fragmented in a completely different way. What I think is significant about this generation, and this is their activation point, by the way, the last time Uranus moved into Sagittarius, 1981 to 1988. So this would be that 7 years where they were activated. What I find significant about this generation related to their mission and unique goal, and I have a longer presentation on this, which we don't have time to do today, but what I find unique about them is that at the centerpiece is coming out of the heels of World War II. Because I remember as a kid looking at Leave It to Beaver and being completely baffled by it. And I'm a kid of the 60s. I'm the Uranus and Virgo generation. And you're like, well, why were you baffled? I was baffled because I'm like, why was the world like this? Like, well, one, I was a kid and thinking like, I remember asking my mom, like, did you see things in color when you were a kid? Right? Because everything was in black and white. But so yeah, beyond that moment of juvenile idiocy, I would say that it it was also so idyllic, like everything seemed to have a sense of order. Why that's important, and it only hit me much later, was that people were what we now dealing with PTSD, both the men, especially the men coming back from war, who didn't want to talk about it and didn't have the means of talking about it as we do now. And then the women who were left behind to kind of take care of the country and who also lost a lot of men. So I think some measure of dealing with kind of creating the sense of safety All these particular things became important. So the activation in Sagittarius, leads to the Reagan Revolution. It's the peak of the Cold War, lasting fear of who's near and far. They had to learn and teach tolerance. Like, what constitutes them and us
Hmm.
is something that the Uranus and Cancer generation had to figure out. Sets the stage for liberation from the protectionisms of its beginnings in Cancer. So we went from, kind of this insulated, seal with different parts of the world, in terms of East and West Germany, for instance, in terms of the Warsaw Pact and all those particular elements, and then NATO. All of this emerges from this particular time, and then even the idea of the rise and fall of the yuppie, moving somewhat from trying to find some sense of security. But the Uranus and Leo generation, August 1955 to 1961, is dealing with something completely different. Creation of greater mobility, in terms of transmission and customization than the world has ever known. Like, you can have a transistor radio, you can have all these different ways in which things become more unique to you. There's this acceleration of the space race. The idea to fight the power while harnessing the power. We have rock and roll surfacing in greater aspects. There's a greater emphasis on youth culture than had ever existed before. And I love Billy Joel's statement, which is reflective of his generation. No, we didn't light it, but we tried to fight it. We didn't start the fire. Their activation was when Uranus moves into Capricorn, 1988, 1995. This was the drastic passing away of the old order of things, where the Berlin Wall is falling, the end of the Cold War. America appears to win. This is the postmodern world. Changes to the Soviet Empire. Sobering retro look at the rise and fall of yuppiedom, really trying to contextualize it. This is also when many hippies became yuppies, right? In terms of trying to deal with the other aspect of, going from Leo and this preservation of self into Capricorn. It was also the triumph of the individual. And then we also have from this the golden age of hip hop, where, it comes or goes from its immersion during Uranus and Sag to, I remember because I was alive during this time, and so was Suzanne, where people like, that's a fad, it's gonna be gone. And then, some years later, we have it on MTV and it's kind of on the radio and infused into the culture.
Oh, dominates the culture.
Now it dominates the culture. Now, Uranus in Virgo, August 1962 to 1968. Staggering changes in consumption, production, and work practices in every area of life. This is also as a sign of Mercury, Virgo. This is the conception of ARPANET, which is the precedent of the internet and the World Wide Web. The phrase personal computer is introduced during this time. From hippie to hipster as a subculture. Changes in the workforce and lifestyle for all previously marginalized people. Virgo being the sign that can't see Aries, as the starting point of the zodiac. So this becomes a point of inclusion for women, students. We have student uprisings that happen in greater number, ethnic minorities, and LGBTQ communities. When I also talk about consumption, one thing I want to mention, this is where we have the emergence and interest related to organic food. And the idea of getting away from highly processed. So this is more for the little guy, I would say. This is my generation. So our activation was when Uranus moves into Aquarius, which is from 1995 to 2003. What happens? Well, the proliferation of the World Wide Web matched with the dot-com bust. Y2K, proliferation of health consciousness and what's organic. And when I say proliferation, notice I said that, we have the start of co-ops and different things, but when we start to see more of this, like a Whole Foods and more co-ops and in markets, this is what I believe my generation did. The rise and consequent dissatisfaction with something called, how we're going, political correctness. War on shadowy groups rather than the Cold War of nation states. So when I say shadowy groups like Al-Qaeda, so it becomes a little guy in an inverse in a weird way. stepping out of the shadow of a single superpower. So we went through nearly a decade where the US was the dominant superpower to now others emerging at this particular point. China, the reemergence of Russia, and then we have then increased globalization, which is again staggering changes in consumption production goes into a different orbit as we get into Aquarius. The Uranus and Libra generation, September 1968 to 1974. We have a bunch of things that also happened during this particular era. Watergate, COINTELPRO, which is the counterintelligence program on any insurgent organizations that might be counter to American notions of democracy and order. Stronger pushes for justice around the world. Turning point of the Vietnam War with the Tet Offensive. We had a crisis with oil, the birth of disco. This was the first war on drugs. All in the Family, which I have to say, if you've never, if you're part of a generation that did not grow up or see All in the Family, I've been watching just snippets of episodes. I really would encourage you to watch it because it was something special in
Mm.
television history. Um, I don't even think it. I mean, Suzanne, what do you think? I don't even think it would be made now
Oh,
if
no, not it could never be made
it.
because
Yeah.
it required a certain understanding that he wasn't to be agreed with. He, but he, they didn't denigrate him. He was allowed to speak his piece, but in doing so, he showed the absurdity of a lot of his beliefs, which sadly, both in our country and other countries too, he would be a hero.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
and I think there's a spirit of disclosure is where I'm getting what I'm getting to that surfaces with Uranus and Libra and awareness, a willing to kind of see both sides, a willingness to engage and look at things rather than a single point of view. So it was make peace, not war. So culture rises in music, that including reggae. And then we have Marvin Gaye's song, What's Going On, that captures the mood of the era. This generation comes of age, we could say, as Uranus moves into Pisces from 2003 to 2010. So there's a greater need for full disclosure and openness from the newsroom to the TV studio with something called reality TV. And then peer-to-peer web services and social media take the place of institutional structures like television and um, music studios, where you can share music and, it's everything becomes a lot more open. Triple gains of the CNN effect, 24-hour news. Gay marriage gains more universal steam. Record gains in visibility for historically marginalized folks like women, blacks, Latinos. And then Ponzi schemes also unfurl during this time. Again, Libra kind of, seeing both sides and getting back to a sense of, going toward ratio. I won't say equanimity or balance because that's not what it's always about. So this is kind of what we could say is the mission related to the Uranus and Libra generation as activated during Pisces. The Uranus and Scorpio generation from 1974 to 1981. This is the fallout from Watergate. We have the 3 Mile incident and general fear of nuclear power, tapping into the deeper recesses of things. The Vietnam War ends with American withdrawal. We have the death of Elvis. Microsoft and Apple are formed. Premiere of Roots, Jaws, and Star Wars. Discovery of Chiron. Explosion of disco with Saturday Night Fever. Incredible blizzards. You're like, well, I'm from Buffalo, New York, so I remember this very vividly. The Shah of Iran falls to Ayatollah Khomeini and video games. So what we see is a microdization kind of going to the inner mysteries of things. This is almost where you can almost believe that Pluto does rule Scorpio in the sense that, yeah, that was shade. I'm owning it. Um, where you can look at the deeper recesses of things and and it's not so much about exploding them as we see with Uranus and Libra, but diving deeper into the muck, you know, um, and how one deals with power, because classically it's a sign of Mars. So, true to form, as Uranus moves into Aries from May 2010 to May 2018, dealing with aspects of power and um, finances, all these particular things really start to surface. World financial austerity during a recession, peak oil concerns, there was Arab Spring, there was Occupy Wall Street, populist risings of extremes like Bernie versus Trump in the US, Black Lives Matter, spike in gun violence, and then heightening tensions with Russia. One other thing is that we also see changes related to the internet and growth related to the power of social media. That's another kind of thing that takes more hold, and concerns about the power of social media, where we have these different court cases that would surface, in terms of what how intrusive or how powerful social media was in our lives
And the lack of regulation.
and the lack of regulation. Yeah. Uranus in Sagittarius, February 1981 to December, shattering traditional controls of communication. So CNN, MTV, Ma Bell is broken, cellular phones. Like, what's Ma Bell? Because I know some generations don't know about Ma Bell. So what becomes significant during this moment is that, and this blows people's minds when I tell them, but I know you remember, Suzanne. We didn't own our phones. You had to pay a lot of money in order to
Mhm.
own your phone. So when you moved from your house, you sometimes had to turn in your phone and get new ones in order to be able to, you know, deal with it. This is the point where now you could buy a phone. This is before cell phones, and it'd be yours, right? Rather than having to turn it in. The other thing is they had a monopoly on everything in terms of control. So it was the Bell Telephone Company that controlled everything related to telephony. And so then we now have the more popular advent of cellular phones. Now, we think of now cell phones like as being able to hold in our hands. At the time, it was like basically, like having like a boombox, equivalent of it. Video games go mainstream and personal computing becomes more iconic. So this is the pinnacle of Cold War fears. Pop and rock and rap dominate the airwaves. We Are the World, the idea of creating a more multicultural world. Crack sweeps the US.
Mm.
Rise of AIDS, Terminator. Now, what's interesting is Terminator echoes Frankenstein from the last Uranus cycle, from the last time Uranus was in Sagittarius. So it's kind of like this idea of something that is man-made or technology kind of coming out of control. Gorbachev's glasnost presages the end of the Soviet Empire, where Russia was starting to open up, or the Soviet Union, and then the Iran-Iraq war ends. What happens now? We're still in this moment. Uranus moves into Taurus, May 2018 to April 2026, when he finally leaves. This is the redrawing of global divisions, perhaps reignition of the Cold War. Now, I got to say this. This is where I'm giving myself a pat in the back. I have been talking about this for almost 20 years. So I've been saying we're going to see a reignition of the Cold War for almost 20 years based on Uranus going into Taurus, which we're seeing, especially with Russia. There's a clear global concern about shrinking finances and resources, and a fight to preserve the global sense of connection that we've achieved. So in Uranus and Sagittarius, this generation got the sense of we are the world. This is a challenge to try to keep that sense of the world,
Yeah, or
and
just keep the world.
or keep the world, right? Last but not least is the Uranus and Capricorn generation, which is yet to come of age, but is about to come of age. December 1988 and April 1995. This is the growth of the captains of industry again. We've seen this before, but yeah. Major political tectonic shifts, including the rise and fall of the Soviet Empire, happened during this time. The World Wide Web emerges. Wildness made civilized. This becomes interesting because we see, Tarzan, the Tarzan narratives. I think there's a couple Tarzan movies that come out. And this is a reworking of major trade agreements like NAFTA. What can we expect as Uranus moves into Gemini from 2026 to 2033? It's going to be reconstitution of some aspects of the Soviet Union, increased micronization of technology, especially for computing needs, and what I think will be a new age of technological development, especially with communication and commerce. How I usually define this generation is that they are builders. You're like, okay, well, what did I mean? It means that if they're builders, they're going to have to rebuild something. And rebuilding means that some things may get shifted, I'll use that word, um, and maybe disassembled in order to be reassembled. So the way to understand this is that every generation, the maturation of another generation at its activation is the raw fodder for the generation that's seeded or born at that time. So Uranus in Cancer, for instance, is activated when Uranus is in Sagittarius, and you'll start to see the overlap in their themes in terms of what Uranus in Sagittarius is doing related to the activation for Uranus in Sagittarius is going to be activated with Uranus in Taurus. And this is a cycle that repeats over 83, 84 years. And it's always a dynamic of opposite by gender, quote unquote masculine to feminine, or we could say assertive to receptive. So your generation's mission isn't just your own, it's part of a temporal network that connects themes of power, energy, identity, resources, creativity, and understanding with others, whether directly your kin or not. And your generation's work is never done. You're still going to be moving forward with your generation's mission. What about Uranus in your personal chart? Well, Uranus is again where you're more activated toward your individuality, not just related to your mission. And I'm just giving you some guidelines to use. I'm not saying this is the final statement. Other people may have other ways in which you might look at it. But when Uranus is angular, meaning if he's in your first, your fourth, your seventh, or 10th house, or connected to particular points like your ascendant, descendant axis, or your midheaven or IC, or when he has what we call Ptolemaic aspects to your Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, or Mars. These are your personal planets. And personal or Ptolemaic aspects are conjunctions. If you know the aspects, sextile, square, trine, and opposition. Natal Uranus connected to the final dispositor or ruler of your ascendant, or if it's your sun or moon. And transiting Uranus connects to a personal point or planet in your chart, meaning if you're a Taurus rising, right, then you likely have been going through some powerful shifts in doing things with Uranus going through Taurus right now. For instance, I hate to put Suzanne on the spot, but I'm going to do it.
Again.
You're Taurus rising, right?
Yes, I won't get it. It'll come within about 1.5 degrees this year.
But we
And
could
so I
say by
won't
virtue of
get it
being in the
next year.
sign, see, you started this thing, with these summits in the last few years, right? Uranus is
Yeah,
doing his work, and so it might be another next level that you reach in a year or so. So I guess it's in the late Taurus for you, with 27 degrees, 28,
right. I don't use whole signs. So yes, it's
right?
28.
Yeah. So he's coming. I think he still has resonance as he's through the sign, but there's more work, a bigger thing that's gonna, come through transit as he's getting closer to your actual ascendant. To kind of see how things come together, I'm using Steve Jobs's chart. So he had a Jupiter Uranus conjunction like we had some time ago, not too long ago, and it was in Cancer for him. So he's a Uranus and Cancer generation. So he was dealing with, we are the world and that idea of bringing the world together, which he did through Apple. And for him, it was square to his Mars, which rules his moon. Um, it doesn't have a connection to his ruler, but it does have a connection directly to his Venus. One of the things I love to talk about with Steve Jobs, which and I own Apple products, so this is not me hating on Apple. Okay. I don't want people to be like, oh, he's probably an Android user. I am not. But I actually think the aesthetic integrity that Steve Jobs had and demand. If you read anything about his biography, you will see this dimension of him. That sense of demand and having Apple products be beautiful is a manifestation of this Venus, Jupiter, Uranus. And I don't know if Apple has maintained those same standards, in terms of creating the beauty related to their product. And I would dare say the level of innovation. You know, Apple revolutionized so many different things. It revolutionized photography, music, in terms of the use of the iPod. And then now what we have in terms of the iPhone, or even the concept of a smartphone largely is at the hands of Apple. Um, it revolutionized how people could make film, and not just photography, but even film photography, or creating, and also sound. All these particular things, I think, is a manifestation of this Venus, Jupiter, Uranus opposition that he had, that he really sought to bring more to the fore.
And in the 11th, Jupiter in the 11th with the Uranus, that's a good spirit there, right? I mean,
Hmm.
and he unfortunately, there's no such thing as he died too young because he was on his own timeline. But I think a lot of people project our own feelings of what else could that man have created? What would have been the next iterations would be so hard to even imagine because his mind was so beyond so many of ours. But I mean, that was and he had, he had his own demons as opposed to the daemon, but he did have a pretty lucky and influential life, which I
He
think you
did.
see
Yeah,
in the maybe the Pluto in the 12th is saying something a little
with a
different.
lot of fortune. Yeah, that's also true.
Yeah, with a lot of fortune.
So what do you do now? I mean, you think about your generation's mission and how you're adding to that or not. And then, like I said, how Jupiter lived out his Jupiter Uranus in Cancer, teamed up with his friends because he teamed up with another Stephen, Stephen Wozniak, and created Apple, which, like I said, led to this major innovation in computing. And see what connections it has to your, other planets and other points in your chart. So, it's navigating between the realms, I would say here. And when I say the realms, the ways by which we can understand the daemon, and I've shown at least three different ways in which that can happen. Um, and not just in the transcendent sense, but also the idea of the personal, impersonal. Um, Personal daemons are not fixed, that but can develop or unfold according to our own spiritual development. The more that we are willing to glimpse our daemon, the more that we're willing to see ourselves. And this goes along with Jung's idea of individuation, moving more toward our consciousness. So closing thoughts. Um, what I would just say and encourage people is this, uh not the point isn't just to get in our touch with our daemon just to have our daemon, but more so to get in touch with our divinity.
Mm.
And the daemon helps point the way. Here's, if anyone wants to take a screenshot of this, here are some particular I think helpful sources of information where you can do more research on the daemon if people want to do that. I recommend nearly all these books. Well, I recommend all of them, especially the one by Kat Nelligan Rose, which also synthesizes a lot of different ideas. But what was impactful for me initially in my journey was The Soul's Code in Search of Character and Calling by James Hillman. Uh, all these books I think you should be able to get pretty easily. So that's me. Um, yeah, if you want to contact me, and also there's my special gift, um,
Which,
which is going to be,
they
yeah,
they will be able to contact you quite readily because all that information is right on your speaker page, and that's where they launched this interview from. So we don't have to remind them how to do that, but please tell them about the gift, because if people are curious about this, the gift is going to be such a useful next step.
yeah. So it's from a longer talk I've given on astrology as daemonic geometry. So I go more into the history of the daemon, and also how it breaks down, especially related to the houses. I don't get so much into the lot of spirit. That was more this particular presentation, nor do I talk as much about Uranus, but I get more into why the houses kind of are structured the way they are and what they reveal beyond
Yeah,
the 11th and 12th house.
that's great. You know, Sam, you just helped jog my memory that I did have another question for you. You walked everybody through AstroSeek, which is great. I love that site. A lot of people, I think, are already familiar with astro.com, or they might think of it, oh, hello, here's my daemon, um, as Astrodienst. It's the same site.
Mhm.
They can calculate the parts, the lots on
I
astro.com.
believe so. Yeah, astro.com. I just think it's, to be honest, I think it's a little harder. Um, in my experience to kind of find it. They don't make it as easy. The lot of fortune is pretty easy to find. I don't see that as easily with a lot of spirit. So let me just see here. Um, if you go to extended chart selection, you
Right.
put
And
in
this is on the assumption that they've already got
your
their
chart
natal
done.
chart input.
Yeah. So it's just that particular page is really just readily set up to show you those particular things. So that's why I've kind of gone more so with AstroSeek than other ones. Now, what you can do when you go to um you can do parts fortunae. Parts fortunae is a lot of fortune, but I don't see where they make it as easy to have the lot of spirit. So that's
Ugh.
why I didn't recommend astro.com.
Okay, so we're going to stay with AstroSeek.
Yeah. So that's
Okay.
that's that was my logic.
Okay. Well, that was pretty great and that was pretty mind-blowing. And you see what I mean about you're going to get an expanded take on all this. And, it's something like what you showed with Prince William's chart, and to a lesser degree with Steve Jobs, how you can just keep going further and further with the house rulerships and then the relationships. And a story really does start to emerge. And that's,
Yes,
I think, the fun of it.
it is the fun of it.
Yeah. So I encourage everybody to definitely download Sam's gift, check this out on AstroSeek, start to explore your own part of spirit and your 11th and 12th house in this context, and see what starts to get emerge from the darkness, or the confusion, or just get clarified from your other approaches that you've used. I think it's great. And Sam, I really thank you for, I mean, you do such meticulous presentations and I really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you,
Well,
everybody.
it's always great to have you. You're always welcome back to anything I do. And I'm going to let you run. I know you've got somewhere to be. And I'm just going to remind everybody there's still more to come on the Soul Centered Astrology Summit. So we will see you next time. Bye for now.